anyone who's ever read the Gospels is familiar with a couple of groups of religious leaders that Jesus Christ frequently encountered and seemingly just as frequently confronted: the Pharisees and the Sadducees. It's obvious in the Gospels that these are the religious leaders of the time, that they're very powerful, that they have a lot of authority. And yet, we never see them in the Old Testament. They weren't instituted in the Mosaic Law. You don't even read about them anywhere in the Old Testament. So, who are these guys and where do they come from? How did they get to the place of having such power and influence at the time of Jesus Christ in Israel? Their history is very much tied to where we left off in our last teaching of dealing with the Maccabean revolt and the introduction of the Hasmonean dynasty, which is another name for the Maccabees. That's their family. And we're going to pick up there and go into a bit more of the history of this, because it does really set for us who the Pharisees and the Sadducees were. We saw last time that by December of 164 BC, during that Maccabean revolt, that Judas Maccabeus had regained all that Antiochus Epiphanes had taken from the Jews. And if you remember, Judas Maccabeus was the son of the priest Mattathias, and he's the one that started the rebellion. So by this time, they have religious freedom restored. They are able to openly read and own the Hebrew Scriptures. They are able to observe the Sabbath without anybody saying anything against them. They can carry out the rite of circumcision, which I'm sure just thrilled all the boys at that time. All of these things that are so important to the Mosaic Law, so important to the Judeans, were all punishable by death under the Seleucid leaders, and really carried out by Antiochus Epiphanes. So when they regained these religious freedoms, and they rededicated the temple, which they did in December of 164 BC, which is celebrated as the Festival of Dedication, Hanukkah in modern times. When they did all that, a lot of folks said, great, we've done it, we've accomplished what we set out to do, let's just stop right there. And then the Maccabees and their most fervent supporters said, no, we don't want to stop here. We want to keep going. We want to keep fighting until we have complete Jewish independence from the Seleucids. That's the beginning of two very divergent and over time very opposing and contentious parties. Two different religious parties that really begin at that point over this matter of we should just be happy to have religious freedom, and the other group saying, no, we want political independence. They continue to fight for that, and you have a couple of different changes of leadership. Judas died, and he was killed, and his brother Jonathan took over, and he only lived a short time before he was killed, and then Simon, the third brother, took over. And it was under Simon in 142 BC that they did accomplish political independence. And that starts, as I mentioned, and this is a bit of a recap, but again, it's important, and I want to show this in light of the Pharisees, and Sadducees and how they fit into this history, that starts this 80-year period of Jewish independence. And during that time, they are governed, Israel is governed by this dynasty, this Hasmonean dynasty of priests. This political governmental role of the high priest first started with Jonathan Maccabeus. This political governmental role is a redefining of the role of high priest as it was first given in the Mosaic Law. There's nothing in the Mosaic Law about the high priest being a governmental leader, a political leader. You had judges, you had kings, and sometimes you had priests who in certain times were backing them up, but it wasn't set up to be ever a theocracy like it became by the time you get to under the Persians is when that first starts to happen, when they're still under Persian rule but have some autonomy. Before then, the Seleucids come in, before the conquering of Alexander the Great and the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. But that's when things really change with what the priests do. And there are continuing effects as this goes on in time. The last of the sons of Mattathias, Simon Maccabeus, he and two of his sons were murdered by his son-in-law in 134 BC. One of his sons, two of them were killed, but one of them escaped. His name was John Hyrcanus. And he then took over power. And he goes on to launch a new military campaign that would have made his grandpa proud. Because he not only, is content, he not only keeps the power that they've had, but he begins to expand territory. He goes in and wages war and a campaign where he is now claiming new territory at the time, not new from what they once had when the kingdom was at its full reign under David. But at the point that he takes over, Palestine, Israel, really consists of the regions of Judea and Israel. Now, when he begins his campaign, he expands that. First, claiming territory on the other side of the Jordan. This is the Jordan River right here. And he claims some territory there, and then he goes down and claims the area of Idumea. Idumea in the Old Testament is known as Edom. You ever remember reading about Edom or hearing about Edom? So this area, this country or region of Idumea was called Edom in the Old Testament, and it was first established or founded by Edom, who originally had, his name originally was Esau. So Jacob's brother Esau, and if you know if you're familiar with Jacob and Esau, then you're familiar with one day Esau coming home from hunting and not doing too well, and he's so hungry that he sees this great pot of pottage, stew, that his brother Jacob's cooking, and he says, "Boy, I'm so hungry, I'd sell my birthright for a bowl of that stew." And Jacob says, "You got it, brother, here it is." And he takes it. He takes it. And then he gets mad afterwards. And he gets so mad that and feels like so mistreated or cheated by Jacob that begins this animosity between his descendants and the Israelites that lasts forever. When Israel comes out of Egypt, when they are under Moses coming out of Egypt, they want to pass through the land of Edom. And, you can see this, how that Become Egypt's right here, right? So they want to pass through this land to get to the promised land. And the Edomites won't let them. They stand against them. So that only makes matters worse, and it makes them, as a nation, outside of the will of God, and God's kind of done with them at that point. The Edomites fought against both Saul and David. Both of those kings waged war with them. And then much, much later in the history of Israel and Judah, the Edomites sided with Nebuchadnezzar when he came in and invaded the land. So when Nebuchadnezzar, with the Babylonian captivity, came in, they backed him against Israel. Now, this land, then, which now John Hyrcanus takes over, this is filled now with Gentiles. They're forced, as all of these areas will be, to convert to Judaism, but you're still filled with Gentiles in these areas that were then captured during this time. Much later, about 100 years later, Herod the Great comes from this region. And the Romans appoint Herod the Great as basically their ruler over Israel when Rome captures them much later in their history. So, going back to the map then, after capturing Idumea, he goes up and captures the area of Samaria. Samaria also has, by this point, a lot of history, a lot of important, significant history that has continuing effects on the land of Israel and the attitudes of the people in it at the time of Jesus Christ. Samaria, if you remember a couple of weeks ago when we were covering the captivities, Samaria was that region that Samaria was the headquarters of Israel, the city of Samaria, and they have the city in the region, but that was the headquarters, and that was the area that with the first captivity, the Assyrian captivity, they took them all out of, and then they repopulated that whole land with people of all different Assyrian nations, and those are the guys that then got in trouble with all of their idolatry, and they were getting eaten by lions, and they sent in the priest. They appealed to the king who sent in a priest from Israel and taught them, and they worshiped the true God, but they worshiped all their other gods, and they became this real mix-up hodgepodge of religion, right? You remember that? Yes. Okay. So during that time, while everything's really crazy, but they have some belief in the true God, at that point in time, then that's when the land, under the Persian rule, the Judeans are allowed to return to the land, and they go in to rebuild the temple. They go in to rebuild the temple, and they're met there by people from Samaria. And the Samaritans want to help. But they are not made up of Israelites pretty much at all. And so, Ezra, Nehemiah, they refuse their help. And if you read, I think it's Nehemiah that covers this, either Ezra or Nehemiah, I'm not sure, I don't remember which, but one of those books covers this history. You know, there's a lot of fighting that goes on with them because when they're not allowed to help, now they get mad and they fight very actively and strongly against them, against the rebuilding of the temple. To the point that those that are rebuilding the temple, it says they had a hammer in one hand and a gun in the other the whole time that they're working. Well, I didn't say a gun, but you get the idea. They had the swords ready at their side. They were ready to fight at any moment. There were some guys that were just guarding, and even the ones working had to be prepared at a moment's notice to dive into battle because these Samaritans were so opposing them. And They don't win, they lose, and the temple gets built. And then the Samaritans say, well, if we couldn't be a part of building your temple, we're going to build our own temple. We didn't like your temple anyway. We're going to build a better temple. And that's what they do. They build their own temple. And they build it in Mount Gerizim. And this is their temple where they go to worship. And they regard their temple as better than the temple of Ezra and Nehemiah. And not only do they build their own temple, but they also come up with their own version of the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch. It's called the Samaritan Pentateuch, and copies of it have survived into, copies of copies into modern time. The good part about it is it helped preserve a particular Hebrew script. The bad part about it is they change places. Let's tweak this history a bit to put ourselves in here more and include this building of our temple, and why this is always a good idea. And so it's this very corrupted version of the Pentateuch that the Samaritans have. So when they are invaded, the temple, John Hyrcanus, he destroys their temple. He tears it down, and that's the end of that. Yet, nevertheless, they continue when they pray to face Mount Gerizim, where that temple was, and pray toward that mountain, which is exactly, specifically what the woman at the well was talking about when she said, we worship, our fathers worship to the mountain, you worship in Jerusalem, referring to that temple. And then Jesus Christ goes on to teach what true worship is. But that's what she's referring to when she talks about worshiping the mountain. It's that temple that was torn down. Now, this John Hyrcanus dies of natural causes. I don't know how that possibly could have happened in that day and age, because none of these guys were dying of natural causes. And he lived a good long life. He died in 104 BC. He was succeeded by his son, who was very cruel, Aristobulus. And not only was he a harsh and cruel leader, just to prove how cruel he was, he killed both his mother and brother. Now, he only lives for a year, but yet during that time, he goes on to capture more territory past Samaria. He captures the region of Galilee, and that's right up here. So here we go back. We had Israel, Judea. They went down into Idumea, crossed the Jordan, up into Samaria, and up into Galilee. Galilee was completely filled with Gentiles, and even during the time of Jesus Christ, even when he was alive, Galilee had more Gentiles living in it than it did Jews. It's often referred to as the Galilee of the Gentiles. And that goes a long way to explain when, I believe it was Philip, was witnessed to by one of the other newly apostles, when they weren't apostles yet, but one of the guys that becomes them, that he asked the question, can any good thing come out of Galilee? And the reason being is because Galilee is considered even as bad, maybe even worse by some, as Samaria, for being this just mixed up bunch of maybe some Jews, maybe some Gentiles, bloodlines have gotten all mixed in. It also goes a long way to explaining why there was always this strife over endless genealogies that's talked about even in the book of Timothy, because everybody was concerned to prove that they really were pure, that they hadn't become one of these Gentiles brought in and converted or just intermarried into it. So during this time, The group that fully supported this governmental, political, military campaign that was overseen by the Hasmonean priest, the still Maccabean family, those people became known as the Sadducees. The Sadducees, the exact origin of that word Sadducees is disputed and at best speculative. Some would like to trace them to priests back in the Old Testament, and even specifically to a priest named Zadok that was under David, King David. But there's no biblical evidence for that, and even the historical evidence that they would cite is kind of thin. Nonetheless, by the time of the Seleucid rulers, it is clear that the priests that are ruling, even before the Hasmonean dynasty, they have been identified as Sadducees. That term has already come in. They are the Sadducees who initially were the ones who backed the Hellenists when Alexander the Great and the Ptolemies, Seleucids all came in. They backed them, they supported them, they aided them. And when it came to this Hasmonean time, they also are the ones that are full supporters not only of the Hasmonean dynasty, but the ones that want to keep on fighting. The ones that want to keep on fighting. Throughout their history, the Sadducees were always politically motivated. They were always very politically motivated. And as Bruce Metzger, who wrote the book that I've been often referring to on this New Testament background, as he stated, as their political authority grew, their religious devotion waned. So the more that they got into power and political power, the less they were having anything really concerned about the things of God, even though they are the priests. In 1 Maccabees, again, that's in the book of the Apocrypha, and I will just again mention that the different books of the Apocrypha you have to categorize in different ways. The books of Maccabees are historical works, and the history in them is regarded as fairly accurate, especially the first Maccabees. But they were regarded as renegades and traitors to the heritage of their fathers. Generally, they came from the highly educated, wealthy, and influential class. They were much smaller in number than the Pharisees by the time you get to the time of Christ, and they were very unpopular with the common people. On the other side of the fence or aisle, or whatever you want to draw the line on, were those that had supported Mattathias and Judas Maccabees up to the point of regaining religious freedom, but then said, no, we do not want to keep going. That's what we wanted. We wanted the freedom to worship God the way that we know is right. We're not interested in political and military power. That group becomes increasingly opposed to the Sadducees, and out of that group, we have the Pharisees come about. And they withdrew their support completely from the Hasmonean dynasty when they moved that goal line after dedicating the temple and said, we're going to keep going till we have political independence. This group was primarily comprised of what originally had been the Hasidians. You remember we covered that a couple of weeks ago. The Hasidians, meaning the pure ones, the pious or pure ones. And that group now gets to be known as the Pharisees during the time of Jonathan Maccabeus. Jonathan was one of the sons of Mattathias. He was that first high priest of the Hasmoneans. That's according to Alfred Edersheim, that this happened under the time of Jonathan. Bruce Metzger would place it under the time of John Hyrcanus. I don't know. I would tend to believe more Alfred Edersheim on this one than Metzger, because Edersheim on history was just so incredibly detailed and thorough. Pharisees, the word Pharisees is generally interpreted to mean the separated ones. Describing the beliefs and practices of the Pharisees, Josephus, the noted Jewish historian, wrote, "The Pharisees are a group of Jews who have the reputation of excelling the rest of their nation in the observance of religion and has exact exponents of the laws." This hyper-strict adherence to the law, this dogmatic, complete following the letter of the law to the extent of completely missing the spirit of the law, has its origins back in these early days. And it only gets worse and worse the more that the tradition grows. The more the tradition grows, the more that they become just so critical, so hyper-religious, what the Pharisees are known for. They regard the Sadducees with the greatest animosity. And this finally ends up breaking out in civil war. After John Hyrcanus, after he dies, then the country, the tensions between these two parties that have just grown, and their influence grown, and their animosity grown, erupts into actual civil war. They are so torn by strife that they are weakened and vulnerable and easy prey when the Romans come in 63 BC under Pompey. And they have no resistance to really wage against them, because by this point they've just made a mess of the country. I'd like to give you a few more differences between the Pharisees and Sadducees in terms of their different standings on doctrines. The Pharisees believed in divine foreordination. They believed that God foreordained events of life, that this did not interfere with free will, but that God had a very direct plan in the affairs of mankind and carried it out through the events of history. The Sadducees didn't believe that at all. They believed strictly in self-determination, that God is not involved in that kind of way in the affairs of man. Man just makes his own destiny. The Pharisees believed in the resurrection of the just and the unjust, and the Sadducees did not. And that's the one thing that probably most of us know, and that's why they were so sad, you see, because they didn't believe in the resurrection. And it's one of the major points, again, that separate the Pharisees to the Sadducees. The Pharisees believed in angels and devil spirits. The Sadducees did not. So far, doctrinally, if you've been kind of keeping track, who looks like the better group? The Pharisees. The Pharisees. Even though they're the ones that are, hyper legalistic and all that, doctrinally, they were the better group. But here on this fourth point that they differ is where then that difference becomes so key. The Pharisees considered the oral tradition just as authoritative as the scriptures, but the Sadducees regarded the scriptures as the only rule for faith and practice. Sadducees got that one right. That oral tradition, and I'll talk about that more in the future, but that oral tradition eventually becomes what ends up after the time of Christ being written down, but that's where Jesus Christ confronts them again and again about that. So that's where by the time you get to Jesus Christ, these two groups have such great power. The Pharisees and the Sadducees, they were religious leaders, and at different points they had a lot of political power. That does wane when you get under the Roman occupation, though, but we'll get into all of that next time.